The morning sunlight drifted lazily through the thin cream curtains of the Miller apartment, painting golden lines across the wooden floor. Outside, the quiet hum of Chicago traffic began to stir, but inside the small home, peace lived, or at least, it tried to. Grace Miller stood by the stove, flipping pancakes while humming softly to the rhythm of an old jazz tune playing from the speaker on the counter. She loved mornings like this, the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the sound of Ethan's footsteps just beginning to echo from the bedroom down the hall. Ethan appeared, shirt half-buttoned, hair still a little tousled from sleep. He stopped in the doorway, watching her with a smile that carried both affection and fatigue. "Still humming that same song?" he asked, his voice teasing but gentle. Grace turned, spatula in hand. "You love this song." He walked toward her and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I love the woman who sings it more." She laughed, leaning into him. "You're late for work." "I'd rather be late with you," he murmured. They stayed that way for a moment, the smell of maple syrup filling the air, the soft sound of a saxophone gliding between them. For anyone watching, they looked like a couple living a simple, beautiful life. But beneath the laughter and morning routines was a silence, an ache that neither of them wanted to name out loud anymore. It had been 3 years since they got married, and still, the spare room in their apartment, painted pale yellow with a tiny crib waiting in the corner, remained empty. They had always dreamed of filling it with laughter, lullabies, and the sweet chaos of parenthood. They had chosen to paint together one afternoon in early spring, laughing and teasing each other as they picked out shades. Grace had said, something bright, something hopeful. Ethan had smiled and agreed. But as the months turned into years, hope became heavier. Every month brought the same routine, quiet expectation, prayer, then disappointment. Grace would buy a pregnancy test, her hands trembling with the same fragile optimism she always had. Ethan would wait outside the bathroom, pretending to be calm. And then, the silence. The kind that said more than words could. On those nights, Grace would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with questions she never dared to ask out loud. What if it never happens? What if this is all there is? Their families tried to be supportive at first. Ethan's mother would call every few weeks, offering gentle advice that always ended with, "Just keep praying, dear. God's timing is perfect." Grace appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't stop the ache. Her sister, Olivia, was the opposite, outspoken, practical, and sometimes unintentionally cruel. Olivia had 2 kids, ages 4 and 6, and loved to talk about them every chance she got. One Sunday afternoon, during a family brunch, Olivia leaned across the table, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "So, any baby news yet?" The table went quiet. Grace forced a small smile and shook her head. "Not yet." Olivia chuckled. "Well, you better hurry. You're 33, Grace. You know clocks don't tick forever." Ethan's hand froze around his fork. He glanced at Grace, who was smiling too tightly, her eyes focused on her plate. Under the table, she reached for his hand and squeezed it, a silent plea not to say anything. The conversation moved on, but the words lingered. That night, as they climbed into bed, Grace stared at the ceiling again. "Maybe something's wrong with me," she whispered. Ethan turned toward her, his brow furrowed. "Hey! Don't ever say that." She blinked hard, fighting the tears threatening to escape. "It's been 3 years, Ethan. 3 years of trying, of waiting, of nothing. What if I can't give you the family you deserve?" He reached for her hand and pressed it against his chest. "You already did," he said softly. "You're my family." Grace's tears fell silently as she buried her face against his shoulder. A few months later, after endless tests and quiet waiting rooms, the doctor's words came like a dull echo. "Mrs. Miller, your test results show that natural conception might be difficult. Your hormone levels are lower than we'd like to see. It doesn't mean impossible, but unlikely." Grace felt her chest tighten. The room felt smaller. The doctor's lips kept moving, but all she heard was the word unlikely again and again. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. When they left the hospital, she said nothing. They walked in silence to the parking lot, the hum of the city muffled by the storm inside them. By the time they reached the car, Grace's tears finally came. She sank into Ethan's arms, shaking. What if it doesn't work? What if this is our forever? He kissed the top of her head. Then our forever will still be beautiful, he whispered. And we'll still be us. But his voice cracked slightly at the end, a sound Grace noticed, even if he tried to hide it. Weeks later, the doctor suggested IVF, in vitro fertilization. It was their best chance, but it was expensive, emotionally demanding, and came with no guarantees. Ethan spent nights researching clinics, success rates, financial plans, anything that might help. Grace watched him from across the couch one evening, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop. He looked exhausted but determined. Ethan, she said softly. He looked up. Yeah? You don't have to carry this alone. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm your husband. That's what I signed up for. She got up, crossed the room, and sat beside him. No, she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. You signed up to love me. Not to fix me. He closed his laptop and kissed her forehead. Then loving you is still my favorite job. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital appointments, hormone injections, and endless waiting. Grace tried to keep her composure, smiling through the exhaustion, pretending not to notice the side effects, the bruises, the nights she cried quietly in the bathroom. Ethan tried to stay strong for her, making dinner, holding her hand during appointments, whispering small jokes when she needed to laugh. But even strength has limits. One night, after another round of treatments, Grace found him sitting alone in the living room, staring at the blank television screen. She sat beside him. You okay? He nodded slowly. Just thinking. About what? He sighed. About how unfair it feels. You're the kindest person I know, and you're the one who has to go through this. Grace reached over and took his hand. We're both going through it, she said quietly. And one day, it'll make sense. He turned to her, eyes glistening. You really believe that? She smiled faintly. I have to. 2 months later, their first IVF cycle began. It was both terrifying and hopeful, a mix of faith and fear. Every morning, Grace would sit by the window, looking out at the skyline while Ethan prepared her injections. He hated doing it, but she always smiled after, pretending it didn't hurt. When the embryo transfer finally happened, they held hands the entire time. The doctor smiled reassuringly. Now we wait. Those were the hardest words. 2 weeks later, Grace stood in the bathroom, staring at the small white stick in her shaking hand. Negative. Her heart shattered. Ethan found her sitting on the bathroom floor, the test clutched in her fist, tears streaming down her face. He dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping his arms around her as she sobbed into his chest. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. It's too much. He held her tighter. Then we'll stop, he said softly. We'll rest. We'll breathe. We'll heal. They sat there in silence, the clock ticking, the future uncertain. But even through the grief, Ethan never let go of her hand. Over the next few days, word began to spread among friends and family, not because Ethan or Grace had told anyone, but because someone at the clinic happened to know Olivia's friend. It didn't take long before whispers turned into gossip. At a family dinner, Grace noticed the glances, subtle but sharp. I just don't understand why they're forcing it, one cousin whispered to another. Maybe it's not meant to be. Or maybe they should just adopt, another added, laughing softly. Grace tried to eat, tried to smile, but every word felt like glass under her skin. Ethan's hand found hers under the table again, the same silent comfort it always was. When they got home, she finally broke down. Why are people so cruel? He didn't have an answer. He just held her until she stopped shaking. That night, Grace stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Her reflection stared back, tired, fragile, but not broken. Ethan walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We'll try again," he whispered. "When you're ready." She turned to look at him. "And if it doesn't work?" He smiled softly. "Then I'll still wake up next to the best thing that ever happened to me." Grace's tears finally fell, but this time, they weren't just from pain, they were from love. Because even in the middle of disappointment, she knew one thing for sure. They weren't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. The autumn wind swept through Chicago with a soft chill that carried the scent of rain and fallen leaves. Grace watched from her office window as people hurried along the sidewalks, umbrellas opening like flowers beneath a gray sky. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, her reflection faint and tired. It had been 6 months since the failed IVF, and though the pain had dulled, the silence it left behind still echoed in the corners of their home. Grace's colleagues at the marketing firm were kind, or at least pretended to be. But kindness, when soaked in curiosity, could cut deep. "Grace, how are you feeling these days?" her coworker Karen asked one morning, leaning casually on the partition between their desks. Grace smiled politely. "I'm fine, thanks." Karen tilted her head. "You know, I heard you and your husband are trying something, science-why?" Grace blinked. "Science-why?" Karen chuckled awkwardly. "Yeah, you know. IVF, right? I read about it once. Needles and lab stuff. Sounds scary." Grace forced a smile. "It's not scary when you want something enough." Karen's grin faltered. "I guess. Still, must be strange, though. Paying doctors to make a baby." Grace's smile stiffened. "It's called hope, Karen." Karen looked embarrassed and mumbled something before walking away, but Grace's hands were already trembling. She stared down at her keyboard, the letters blurring through her tears. That night, she didn't mention it to Ethan. She didn't want to burden him with one more hurt. But Ethan noticed anyway. He always did. As they sat on the couch watching TV, her head resting on his shoulder, he whispered, "Rough day?" She nodded slightly. "Just people being people." He kissed the top of her head. "Then let's be us. The good kind of people." Grace smiled faintly. "We already are." 2 weeks later, Ethan got a call from his mother. "Ethan," she began, her tone soft but loaded with hesitation. "I ran into Lydia at church yesterday. She mentioned something personal. About you and Grace." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What did she say?" "That you're doing IVF?" He sighed. "We did one round, yes." A pause. Then, "Oh, honey, you know I love you both, but don't you think you're rushing God a little?" Ethan closed his eyes. "Mom. I just mean, maybe you should wait. Pray more. Maybe this is a sign." He stayed quiet for a moment before saying, "Mom, Grace prays every night. She's cried on her knees more times than I can count. If this is rushing God, then maybe he can tell us himself." His mother hesitated, then said softly, "I just don't want you two to get hurt again." "We already are," Ethan replied quietly, then ended the call. When Grace found him sitting on the porch later that evening, his hands clasped, eyes distant, she didn't need to ask. She just sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Was it your mom again?" she asked gently. He nodded. "She means well. But it feels like everyone has an opinion about our pain." Grace sighed. "They talk because they can. We endure because we must." Winter crept in slowly, wrapping the city in layers of gray. For the Millers, the season felt heavier than usual. The laughter that used to fill their small home had quieted into whispers. One night, they attended a family dinner at Olivia's house. It was supposed to be a celebration. Olivia's son had just won a school award. The table was set beautifully, the aroma of roast chicken and buttered potatoes filling the room. But even celebrations had shadows. Halfway through dinner, Lydia, their cousin, smiled slyly. So, Grace, any new experiments? Grace's fork froze midair. Excuse me? Lydia laughed. You know, baby experiments. The whole test tube thing. I heard it's expensive. You two must really want a child. The table went silent. Ethan's jaw tightened. Grace felt her face flush with shame and anger. Olivia laughed awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension. Lydia, don't be rude. Lydia shrugged. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. It's unnatural. If God wanted it to happen, it would have happened. Ethan stood abruptly. The chair scraped the floor with a loud screech. We're done here. He took Grace's hand and guided her toward the door. Grace said nothing until they were in the car. Then, quietly, you didn't have to walk out. Yes, I did, Ethan said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I won't sit there while people who claim to love us mock you. Grace stared out the window, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. They don't understand. Then they don't deserve to. Over the next few months, the whispers didn't stop, they simply became quieter, more polished, dressed in fake concern. When Grace went to baby showers, people would ask her gently, so when's your turn? When she declined invitations, they'd say, she's avoiding us because she's bitter. At church, one of the older women patted her hand and said, Child, stop forcing God's hand. You'll get pregnant when he says so. Grace smiled politely, but inside, she wanted to scream. Ethan watched her slowly withdraw, from friends, from family gatherings, from the cheerful woman she used to be. She smiled less, spoke less, dreamed less. One evening, as they sat quietly on the couch, he turned off the TV and faced her. Grace, he said softly. I miss your laughter. She looked at him, startled. My laughter? He nodded. You used to fill this house with it. Now, it feels like the walls miss you. Grace's eyes glistened. Maybe I'm just tired of pretending I'm okay. He took her hand. Then don't pretend with me. She broke then, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in quiet sobs that came from deep within. He pulled her close, holding her as though love itself could keep her from shattering. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For failing. He pulled back slightly, his voice firm but gentle. You didn't fail. We're still here, Grace. We're still trying. That's not failure, that's courage. Spring came again, soft, bright, and full of false promises. One Sunday, as they walked through the park, they saw families picnicking under blooming trees. Children chased bubbles, parents laughed, and for the first time in months, Grace smiled genuinely. Ethan noticed. What are you thinking? She shrugged lightly. That maybe it's time to try again. Ethan stopped walking. You're sure? Grace nodded slowly. I don't want fear to be the last thing we feel about this. He smiled, relief flickering through his eyes. Then we'll try again. They stood there in the middle of the park, surrounded by laughter and sunlight, holding hands like two people who refused to surrender. When they returned to the clinic, the nurse greeted them kindly. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Miller. Grace smiled nervously. Hopefully, this will be the last time. The doctor met them with warmth and cautious optimism. You both did remarkably well last round. Sometimes, it just takes a little more time. Grace nodded, her hand finding Ethan's instinctively. We're ready. As they went through the new cycle, things felt different this time. Not easier, never easier, but quieter. The chaos of fear had given way to a calm sort of faith. Each injection, each blood test, each wait felt like a step closer to something unseen but deeply believed in. Ethan often whispered to her during their drives home from the clinic, "This time feels different." And Grace would reply softly, "It does." But not everyone shared their faith. When Olivia heard about their second attempt, she rolled her eyes. "You're doing it again? Grace, you're torturing yourself." Grace stayed calm. It's my choice. Olivia sighed dramatically. I just think you should stop chasing miracles. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Grace looked at her sister, really looked, and for the first time, didn't feel anger. She just felt sad. Maybe miracles chase the people who don't give up, she said quietly, then walked away. Ethan found her later that night sitting on the balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, city lights twinkling below. He handed her a mug of tea. Rough day? Grace smiled weakly. You could say that. He sat beside her. Do you regret it? Doing this again? She shook her head. No. Because even if it fails again, at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll never wonder what if. He nodded, watching the lights with her. Then let's see where hope takes us. Days turned into weeks. The injections ended, the procedures done. Now all that remained was waiting, again. Grace spent those days differently this time. She read more, painted again, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. For the first time, she wasn't trying to fill the silence with distraction, she was learning to live inside it. Ethan noticed how peace looked on her, even when uncertainty shadowed it. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, he whispered, "You've changed." She smiled faintly. Maybe I've stopped begging for what I want and started believing it'll come when it's time. He kissed her temple. That's faith. She looked at him. No. That's love. But the whispers didn't stop completely. Some came from people who still couldn't understand why they'd keep trying after failing once. Grace overheard a friend at church whisper, "It's desperation. They should just accept reality." And for the first time, Grace didn't cry. She didn't shrink. She didn't even flinch. She simply smiled to herself and thought, maybe desperation is what miracles are made of. When the clinic called for her final test, her heart raced as it had before, but this time, she felt peace. Ethan held her hand as they walked into the building, the familiar scent of disinfectant oddly comforting now. The nurse smiled softly. You know the drill. Just a small sample, and we'll call you when the results are in. Grace nodded, trying to keep her breathing steady. When they left the clinic, Ethan looked at her with gentle eyes. No matter what happens, you're my forever. She squeezed his hand. And you're mine. That night, they didn't talk about results or statistics or what-ifs. They made dinner together, danced in the kitchen, laughed until their sides hurt, and for the first time in a long while, they felt free. Because hope, they had learned, was not just waiting for something to happen. It was living fully until it did. And as Grace fell asleep in Ethan's arms that night, she whispered, half dreaming, I think something's changing. He smiled against her hair. Me too. The morning was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just happen, it settles, like a calm after years of storms. Ethan woke to the sound of birds outside their apartment window. For the first time in months, he felt rested. Grace was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady, one hand curled against his chest. He studied her face, the faint lines of exhaustion, the small scar near her eyebrow, the quiet strength that had carried them both. He smiled to himself. You're my miracle already, he whispered. Grace stirred, eyes fluttering open. What did you say? Nothing, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Just talking to my favorite person. She smiled, her voice still drowsy. Flattery before coffee? You're evolving. He laughed, and the sound filled the room, warm, real, familiar. For a moment, everything felt normal again. That morning, over breakfast, Grace said something she hadn't said in a long time. I'm not scared anymore. Ethan looked up from his coffee, surprised. Not scared? She nodded, smiling faintly. Of failure. Of what people think. Of what comes next. I've been living in fear for years, Ethan. I think I'm done. He studied her face, realizing she meant it. Then we do this, he said quietly. One last time. No pressure, no fear. Just love. Grace reached across the table and took his hand. Just love, she echoed. They spent the next few days preparing for their second IVF cycle, this time with a quiet determination instead of desperation. They didn't tell anyone. Not Olivia, not Ethan's mother, not even close friends. This round was theirs alone. Ethan had sold his old college guitar months before, just to help pay for the first attempt. This time, he didn't have much left to sell, but he did something else. He started taking extra shifts at work, working long evenings while Grace stayed home. One night, she waited up for him, the living room dimly lit by a single lamp. When he walked in, tired but smiling, she asked, "When do you sleep?" He shrugged, hanging his coat. "After I make sure we can afford Hope." She stood and wrapped her arms around him. "You're doing too much." He held her close. "So are you." They stood in silence, their hearts beating in rhythm, two people clinging to a shared dream that refused to die. The new clinic was brighter, the doctors more encouraging. Grace felt it the moment they walked in. Hope didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. During her first appointment, the doctor, Dr. Nolan, smiled warmly. "You've both been through a lot, I see. But I want you to know something, second chances are where miracles like to hide." Grace smiled back. "Then we'll look for ours." The treatments began again. The injections, the blood tests, the waiting, all familiar, but somehow lighter this time. Ethan was there every morning, holding her hand through it all. "You okay?" he'd ask after every injection. She'd nod, smiling. "Still breathing. Still fighting." He'd kiss her forehead. "That's my girl." They turned their struggle into something sacred. Every small act, every needle, every doctor visit, became a prayer. One Sunday morning, they went to church. They hadn't been there in months, not since the gossip had become too heavy. But that day, something drew them back. The pastor was speaking about faith. "Sometimes," he said, "God's timing feels cruel. You ask, you wait, you weep, and it seems he doesn't hear. But maybe, just maybe, he's not denying you. Maybe he's preparing everyone watching your story to learn something they wouldn't have learned otherwise." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Ethan reached for her hand and squeezed it. When they got home, Grace whispered, "Do you think that's what this is about? Teaching people?" Ethan smiled. "Maybe it's about teaching us, too." She nodded. "Then I hope we learn everything we're supposed to." Days passed quietly. There were moments of fear, yes, fear never disappeared completely, but there was also peace. One afternoon, as Grace sat by the window painting a small canvas of pink and yellow flowers, Ethan watched her from the doorway. He hadn't seen her this peaceful in years. "What ya painting?" he asked, leaning against the frame. She looked up and smiled. "Hope." He chuckled. "What does hope look like?" She shrugged. "Different every time I try to paint it." He walked over, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "That's because hope isn't meant to be finished." Grace smiled softly. "Maybe that's true." A week before the embryo transfer, Grace got a call from her sister Olivia. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while," Olivia said, her tone casual. Grace hesitated. "Yeah, been busy." Olivia sighed. "You're not doing it again, are you?" Grace froze. "Doing what?" "You know what I mean. The IVF thing." Grace stayed silent. Olivia continued, "Grace, I'm just saying, don't you think it's too much? Maybe it's time to accept that it's not meant to be." Grace closed her eyes, steadying her voice. "Olivia, when something means this much to you, giving up isn't peace, it's surrender. And I'm not ready to surrender." There was a long pause. Then Olivia said quietly, "I just don't want to see you hurt again." Grace smiled sadly. "I'm already hurt, Liv. But at least now I'm hurting with purpose." The embryo transfer was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Grace barely slept the night before. Ethan woke early, making her tea, his own nerves hidden behind a calm smile. In the clinic, the air was quiet and sterile, but somehow filled with warmth. As they lay side by side in the small procedure room, Ethan held her hand tightly. Dr. Nolan smiled reassuringly. "All set, Grace. Just relax. Think happy thoughts." Grace took a deep breath. "I'm thinking of home." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Of us?" She smiled. "Always." The procedure was quick. When it was done, Dr. Nolan smiled again. "Now we wait. And we hope." Grace nodded, tears filling her eyes. "We've gotten good at both." The waiting days were the hardest. Each morning felt endless, each night heavy with what-ifs. But Grace refused to live in fear this time. She read, painted, cooked, and even went out for walks in the park. She laughed again, genuinely. One evening, she and Ethan sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching the city lights flicker below. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a moment. "I think love doesn't go unanswered forever." She looked at him, tears glistening. "You really believe that?" He smiled. "I have to. Otherwise, what was all this for?" She rested her head against his shoulder. "For Faith. For us." A few days later, Ethan came home from work to find Grace sitting at the table with a small envelope in her hands. She looked up, eyes trembling. "The clinic called. They sent the results." Ethan froze. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Do you want to open it together?" Grace nodded. He sat down beside her, his hands shaking slightly as he tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A few words. Grace's breath hitched. Ethan read it silently, then looked up at her with tears forming in his eyes. "It's positive," he whispered. "Grace, it's positive." She stared at him, uncomprehending for a second, then it hit her. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Ethan, we did it. We really did it." He pulled her into his arms, both of them laughing and crying at the same time, the weight of years melting away. "I told you," he whispered against her hair. "Love doesn't go unanswered forever." The days that followed were filled with awe and disbelief. Grace moved through life carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid that joy itself might vanish if she breathed too hard. Every morning, Ethan would place his hand gently on her stomach and whisper, "Good morning, little one." Grace would laugh softly. "You talk like she can hear you." "Of course she can," he'd say. "She's ours." But not everyone celebrated right away. When they finally told family, the reactions were mixed. Olivia cried first, shock mixed with guilt. "Grace, I can't believe it. I'm so sorry for doubting you." Grace hugged her. "It's okay. You were afraid for me. I get it." Even Ethan's mother, who had once told them they were rushing God, called in tears. "I was wrong, son. I should have believed with you." Ethan smiled softly through his tears. "It's never too late to believe, Mom." As the months passed, Grace's belly grew, and so did everyone's awe. People who had whispered behind their backs now spoke with wonder. Even Karen from work, once curious and cruel, stopped by with flowers. "I'm sorry," she said awkwardly. "I didn't understand before." Grace smiled kindly. "Most people don't. But now you do." Karen nodded, her eyes misty. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Grace's voice softened. "Not stronger. Just loved enough to keep trying." One evening, as they set up the small nursery, the same room that had stayed empty for years, Ethan stood in the doorway, watching Grace hang a mobile above the crib. She looked back at him and smiled. "We finally get to use it." He walked in slowly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Do you remember the day we painted this room?" She nodded. "I do." The sound of the rain was gentle that morning, a soft drizzle against the window, the kind that made the world slow down. Grace stood in the kitchen, humming quietly as she poured herself a glass of warm milk. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the small movements within. She smiled. "You really like mornings, don't you?" she whispered. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, still half asleep. "Who likes mornings?" Grace turned and laughed. "Our daughter, apparently." He grinned, walking over to place a hand on her belly. "Of course she does. She takes after you." Grace leaned into his chest. "You think she'll have your eyes?" He smiled. "I just hope she gets your patience." Grace raised a brow. "Then we're doomed." "I ran out of patience about 3 months ago." They both laughed, the kind of laughter that came easily now, soft, genuine, and full of gratitude. The pregnancy was smooth, but not without its small fears. Every doctor's appointment carried both hope and a quiet dread. Every ultrasound made them hold their breath. At one appointment, Dr. Nolan smiled at them from behind the screen. "She's strong. Heartbeat looks perfect." Grace exhaled slowly, tears brimming. "I still can't believe she's real." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "Believe it. She's ours." Dr. Nolan smiled knowingly. "You two are a story I'll be telling for years." Grace blushed. "Please don't make it sound too dramatic." The doctor laughed. "Grace, you've lived through something most people wouldn't survive. You're allowed to call it a miracle." They left the clinic that day hand in hand, stepping into the soft glow of afternoon sunlight. Ethan glanced at her. "You know, maybe we should start thinking about names." Grace smiled. "Already have one." He looked surprised. "You do?" "Yeah," she said softly. "Hope." Ethan stopped walking. "Hope?" Grace nodded, eyes shining. "Because that's what she is. Everything we prayed for, cried for, waited for, all wrapped into one tiny heartbeat." Ethan smiled, his voice thick. "Hope Carter. I like it." Grace laughed softly. Then it settled. The months went by faster than they expected. Each day was filled with new changes, new little joys. Ethan started a journal for his unborn daughter. Every night before bed, he'd write a short note to her. "Today your mom painted the nursery again. She says the walls aren't yellow enough. I think they're perfect, just like you'll be. We felt you kick again tonight." Your mom cried. I pretended not to, but I did too. Grace found the journal one day and smiled through tears. "You're going to make her cry before she even learns to talk," she teased. Ethan grinned. "Then I'm doing my job as a dad." As the due date approached, their small apartment was filled with gifts, little onesies, baby blankets, a crib that Ethan struggled for hours to assemble. One evening, as he fumbled with a stubborn screw, Grace laughed from the doorway. "Need help, handyman?" He looked up, frustrated. "I swear this thing has more parts than an airplane." She walked in and sat beside him. "Maybe it's testing your patience." He smiled. "I thought that was your job." She gasped playfully. "Excuse me?" Ethan raised his hands in surrender, laughing. Okay. The baby can test my patience. You just test my heart rate." They both dissolved into laughter, the sound echoing through the tiny room. Then one afternoon, as Grace was sorting baby clothes, her phone rang. It was Olivia. "Hey," Grace answered, smiling. "Hey, sis," Olivia said softly. "Can I come over? There's something I need to say." Grace hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Of course." When Olivia arrived, she carried a small box in her hands. Her eyes were red, her expression nervous. Grace led her to the living room. "What's this?" Olivia handed her the box. "Something I've been meaning to give you." Inside were tiny knitted booties, pale yellow, soft, handmade. Grace looked up in surprise. "You made these?" Olivia nodded, her voice trembling. Yeah. Mom taught me years ago. I wanted to make something for her. For Hope. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Olivia took a deep breath. I was wrong, Grace. About everything. About IVF, about judging you. I thought I was protecting you from pain, but really, I was afraid that if you kept hoping and it failed again, I wouldn't know how to help you. I'm so sorry. Grace reached for her hand. Olivia, you were scared. So was I. But you never stopped loving me. That's what matters. Olivia nodded, crying quietly. You deserve all of this, Grace. You really do. Grace smiled. So do you. You deserve to see what faith looks like when it finally blooms. They hugged for a long time, the weight of years dissolving between them. Later that evening, Ethan came home to find Grace sitting on the couch, holding the knitted booties. He smiled. Those are cute. Where'd you get them? Olivia made them. Ethan raised his brows. Olivia? Wow. That's unexpected. Grace nodded, smiling softly. She apologized. It felt real. Ethan sat beside her. See? People can change. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's part of the miracle too. A few weeks later, Ethan's mother called. Her voice was softer than Grace had ever heard. Grace, honey, she said. I was thinking, could I come visit before the baby arrives? I'd love to help. Grace hesitated. Their relationship had been strained, but she could hear sincerity in the woman's voice. Of course, Grace said finally. You're always welcome. When she arrived a few days later, she brought homemade soup, baby blankets, and tears she couldn't hold back. I said terrible things, she whispered, taking Grace's hands. I told Ethan he was wasting his time. I told you that you were rushing God. But I was wrong. You didn't rush him, you trusted him. And I should have trusted you. Grace squeezed her hands gently. We all learn faith differently. What matters is that we learn it. Ethan's mother hugged her tightly. You're a good woman, Grace. My son is lucky. Grace smiled, her eyes misty. We're both lucky. That night, as the three of them sat together in the living room, the air was warm with forgiveness and new beginnings. Ethan's mother looked around the nursery, her expression thoughtful. I never thought I'd see this day, she said softly. Ethan smiled. Neither did we. She turned to Grace. You taught me something, you know. I used to think miracles were about timing. But they're about persistence. Grace's voice was tender. Sometimes, you have to keep believing long after it stops making sense. His mother nodded, her eyes glistening. You did that. And look at you now. As Grace's due date neared, anticipation filled the air. Every day felt like a countdown. Ethan packed the hospital bag 3 times just to be sure. Then, one early morning, Grace woke up to a sharp pain in her stomach. She sat up, breathing heavily. Ethan. He stirred, half asleep. I think it's time. He bolted upright. What? Now? Grace nodded, gripping his hand. Now. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and shaky breaths. Ethan tried to stay calm, but his hands trembled on the steering wheel. Breathe, Grace. Just breathe, he kept saying, though his own breathing was ragged. Grace laughed through the contractions. You're the one who needs to breathe. They both laughed, even through the pain. Hours later, Grace lay in the delivery room, sweat on her forehead, determination in her eyes. Ethan was beside her, whispering encouragement. You've got this, baby. You've got this. Grace squeezed his hand so tightly he thought she might break it. I can't, she gasped. Yes, you can, he said firmly. You've come too far to stop now. She closed her eyes, gathered every ounce of strength she had left, and pushed one final time. And then, a cry. Small, beautiful, powerful. The sound filled the room, echoing through their hearts. Ethan froze, tears already streaming down his face. Grace collapsed back onto the bed, sobbing with relief and joy. The nurse smiled. Congratulations. You have a baby girl. They placed the tiny, wrinkled, perfect baby into Grace's trembling arms. Grace looked down, eyes wide, tears falling freely. Hello, Hope, she whispered. You took your time. Ethan leaned in, his voice breaking. She's perfect. Grace smiled through tears. She's ours. For a long time, they just stared, 3 hearts beating in rhythm, one miracle binding them together. Ethan kissed Grace's forehead. You did it. Grace shook her head, smiling weakly. We did it. Word spread quickly through friends and family. Olivia rushed to the hospital with flowers. Ethan's mother came with tears and a camera. Even Karen from work sent a message, welcome to the world, baby Hope. Grace looked around at everyone, realizing that the people who once mocked, doubted, or misunderstood had all been transformed by one thing, the miracle they had witnessed. That evening, as the sun set outside the hospital window, Ethan stood holding his daughter. She was small, fragile, and yet felt heavier than the world, not in weight, but in meaning. He looked down at her sleeping face and whispered, You were worth every tear. Every prayer. Every moment we thought it was over. Grace smiled from her bed. She's going to change people, you know. Ethan nodded, eyes soft. She already has. Later that night, after everyone had left, Grace whispered, Ethan? Yeah? Do you think people will ever understand what this means to us? He looked at her, then at their daughter. They don't have to. We do. That's enough. Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. Yeah, that's enough. Outside, the rain had started again, soft, gentle, familiar. And inside that small hospital room, surrounded by love and new life, Ethan and Grace held the proof that sometimes, waiting doesn't mean losing. Sometimes, waiting means preparing, because the best miracles are the ones that come right after you stop trying to control how they'll arrive. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, soft and golden, painting everything in warmth. Grace stirred, her body still sore but her heart full. Beside her, in a small crib by the window, lay Hope, their daughter, their answered prayer, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. Grace smiled, watching her chest rise and fall in peaceful rhythm. For years, she had imagined this sight. Now it was real. Tangible. Alive. The door creaked open quietly. Ethan stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. His eyes were tired but glowing. Morning, Mom, he said softly. Grace turned toward him, her smile radiant. Morning, Dad. He grinned and handed her a cup. You'll need this. Parenting apparently requires caffeine and blind faith. Grace chuckled, taking a sip. We've got plenty of both. Ethan sat beside her, their shoulders touching. Together, they watched Hope sleep. For a long time, neither spoke. There was nothing to say, their silence was filled with gratitude. A few days later, they returned home. The yellow nursery that had once felt empty now pulsed with life. The air smelled of baby powder and lavender lotion. Ethan carried the car seat inside, careful as if it contained glass. Grace followed, holding the diaper bag like a treasure chest. He placed the car seat gently on the floor and exhaled. We're home, little one. Grace knelt beside it and unbuckled Hope, lifting her gently. Welcome home, baby. Ethan looked around their apartment and laughed softly. It feels different. Grace nodded, her eyes misty. It's not just a house anymore. It's a home. The early weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, bottle feedings, and lullabies whispered under moonlight. Grace often woke to find Ethan already awake, holding Hope against his chest. He'd look up and smile sleepily. She likes to listen to my heartbeat. Grace would smile back. She's used to it. It's been her lullaby for 9 months. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, they'd sit together in the rocking chair, hope cradled between them. Ethan would whisper, "Can you believe she's real?" And Grace, her head resting against his shoulder, would reply softly, "Every second, I still check to make sure I'm not dreaming." One Saturday afternoon, Olivia visited again, this time with her husband and kids. They came bearing gifts and laughter. As soon as Olivia stepped into the nursery and saw Hope sleeping, her eyes filled with tears. "She's beautiful," Olivia whispered. "Grace, she's perfect." Grace smiled proudly. "She's our miracle." Olivia reached out, touching the baby's tiny hand. "I've never seen something so small make such a big change in people." Grace chuckled. "She did that before she was even born." Olivia turned to Ethan. "You two have no idea how much your stories changed everyone. Mom can't stop talking about faith now. Even our friends who used to laugh, they've stopped." Ethan smiled humbly. "Maybe it's not about changing people. Maybe it's just about showing them that pain can still grow something good." Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you did that, and more." A few weeks later, the church invited Ethan and Grace to share their story during a Sunday service. Grace hesitated at first. "I don't know if I can do that," she told Ethan. "I'm not good at speeches." Ethan smiled. "You don't have to give a speech. Just tell the truth." So that Sunday, they stood side by side in front of the congregation. Grace held Hope in her arms, her heart pounding as she looked at the familiar faces, some that had once judged, some that had doubted, some that had even mocked. But when she began to speak, her voice was calm and steady. "We prayed for years," she said softly. "We begged, we cried, we questioned everything, including ourselves. We thought faith meant never feeling fear. But we learned that faith is holding on even when fear feels stronger." She glanced down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully. "We went through IVF twice. The first time failed. We thought it was over. But something inside us said to try again. And now, we have her. Our little proof that miracles still happen." The room was silent, many wiping away tears. Ethan spoke next. "We used to think this journey was a punishment. Now we know it was preparation, not just for us, but for everyone watching us. Because sometimes, the miracle isn't the baby. It's the belief that survives until the baby comes." Grace smiled, her voice trembling. "We want to thank everyone who prayed with us, who learned with us, even those who doubted us. You all are part of this story." The congregation erupted into applause. Ethan reached for her hand, and together they stood, not as victims of circumstance, but as living proof of perseverance. After the service, people gathered around them. Old friends, neighbors, even those who had whispered behind their backs. One by one, they approached with apologies and hugs. Karen, Grace's former co-worker, was among them. Her voice shook. "I used to laugh behind your back, Grace. I thought IVF was desperate. I didn't understand. But watching you, seeing your strength, I see now how wrong I was. I'm sorry." Grace smiled kindly, holding Hope closer. "You're forgiven. Life has a way of teaching us when we're ready." Karen nodded, tears spilling. "You've taught me more about faith than church ever did." Grace touched her arm gently. "Then that makes it all worth it." That evening, after everyone had left, Grace sat on the porch with Ethan, Hope sleeping in her arms. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Do you realize it's been almost 6 years since we first tried?" Grace nodded, gazing at the horizon. 6 years of waiting. 6 years of hope. He smiled. Fitting name, then. She looked at him, her eyes shimmering. "Do you ever wish it had happened sooner?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember, if it had, we wouldn't have become who we are now." We needed the waiting to become ready. Grace nodded, her heart full. Yeah, we did. They sat in silence, the gentle sounds of crickets filling the air. Months passed, and hope grew, from fragile newborn to bright-eyed baby, filling their home with laughter. Her first smile came one sunny morning when Ethan made a ridiculous face at her. Grace burst into laughter. She definitely has your sense of humor, she teased. Ethan grinned proudly. That's my girl. Her first word came months later, Dada. Ethan cried right there on the living room floor. Grace laughed until she cried too. Don't worry, she told Hope. You'll say Mama soon enough. Ethan wiped his tears. It's okay. She said the best one first. Then came Hope's first birthday, a day that felt like more than a celebration. It was a full-circle moment. Their small backyard was decorated with balloons and fairy lights. Family and friends gathered, Olivia, Ethan's mother, Karen, and even a few neighbors who had once kept their distance. Everyone brought gifts, but the real gift was the unity that filled the space, forgiveness, understanding, love reborn. Ethan stood at the grill, flipping burgers. Grace sat with Hope on her lap, laughing as Olivia snapped pictures. At one point, Ethan's mother raised a glass. To Grace and Ethan, she said, her voice full of emotion. For teaching us that faith is not about seeing, but believing before you see. The crowd echoed, to Grace and Ethan. Grace blushed, holding back tears. No, she said softly. To all of us, for learning together. The crowd cheered again, and music filled the air. As evening settled, Grace stepped aside for a moment, watching the lights twinkle. Olivia came to stand beside her. You okay? Grace smiled. Better than okay. Olivia followed her gaze to Ethan playing with Hope on the grass, both of them laughing. You know, Olivia said, if someone had told me years ago this would happen, I'd have called them crazy. Grace chuckled. Miracles have that effect. Olivia nodded. You've changed me, Grace. I used to think faith was just words. But watching you, I understand now. Faith is doing. It's waiting. It's believing even when the world laughs. Grace's voice softened. That's what it was for us. And I'm glad it reached you too. They hugged, tears glistening in the golden light. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan and Grace stood on the porch again. Hope was asleep inside, surrounded by new toys and half-eaten cake. Ethan slipped his arm around her. We did it, he whispered. Grace leaned into him. Yeah. We really did. He smiled. You know what's funny? The same people who mocked us now look at us like we're a story worth telling. Grace nodded. That's how God writes, he takes what breaks you and makes it someone else's lesson. Ethan chuckled softly. Maybe that's why he made us wait. Grace smiled faintly. So we'd learn patience? He shook his head. So we'd learn to love through the waiting. She turned to him, eyes glistening. Then I'd wait all over again. Ethan kissed her forehead gently. Me too. Inside, the baby monitor crackled softly, Hope's tiny breath steady and calm. Grace looked back through the window at her daughter, sleeping under the glow of the nightlight. She whispered, Thank you for choosing us. Ethan squeezed her hand. And thank God for not letting us give up. They stood there, watching the stars above their quiet home, the same stars they had prayed under for years. This time, there were no tears of pain. Only peace. Because sometimes, life doesn't give you what you want right away, it gives you time to become who you need to be first. And when the miracle finally arrives, you realize it was never just about receiving, it was about transforming.